Tonight, our story takes us to New Orleans, Louisiana, 1918. A city that had always lived between worlds, between French and American, between the sacred and the profane, between the living and the dead. The Great War was pulling young men across the Atlantic. Storyville, the infamous red light district, had just been shuttered by order of the United States Navy. And jazz, born in the parlors and dance halls of that very district, was spilling out into the streets and into the soul of the city itself. But something else was moving through New Orleans that year, something that came in the night through the back doors of homes and left blood on the walls and axes on the floor. Over the course of 18 months, at least 12 people were attacked in their beds. The victims were grocers and their wives, a pregnant woman, an elderly barber, a teenage girl living alone. Their skulls were split open with their own axes, weapons the killer never brought with him, but found inside the homes he entered. He chiseled out panels and back doors to get inside. He stole nothing. He left the weapons behind, and he vanished every time without a trace. Then, in March of 1919, a letter arrived at the offices of the Times-Picayune newspaper. It was dated from hell. The author claimed to be a demon, invisible and immortal. He said he would kill again on the following Tuesday night, unless every home in the city was playing jazz music. That night, New Orleans played music like it had never played before. Not out of joy, out of fear. No one was killed. The Axeman was never caught. He was never identified. And after one final murder in October of 1919, he disappeared as completely as if he had never existed at all. In the first half of this video, we'll go through what happened during those 18 months, every attack, every false arrest, every failed lead, and the letter that turned a city into a concert hall. In the second half, we'll look at what the killer's behavior might reveal about the kind of mind that did this, what his method of entry, his choice of victims, his refusal to steal, and his letter from hell can tell us about who he was and what was driving him. This is the story of the Axeman of New Orleans. New Orleans in the spring of 1918 was a city that belonged to no single country, no single culture, and no single century. It had been French, then Spanish, then French again, then American, and through all of those transitions, it had remained, stubbornly and unmistakably, itself. A port city built on a crescent of swampland at the mouth of the Mississippi River, it was home to nearly 350,000 people, making it the largest city in the American South. The Great War was reshaping daily life. Young men were being drafted and shipped to training camps before crossing the Atlantic. Liberty Bond parades filled Canal Street with marching sailors and brass bands. Patriotic propaganda hung in shop windows. The city's German community, once prominent enough to hold a 5,000-person bazaar just 3 years earlier, was quietly erasing itself, changing surnames, shuttering cultural societies, watching as Berlin Street was renamed General Pershing Street overnight. But the most dramatic change had come 5 months before the first murder. On the 12th of November, 1917, the United States Navy had ordered the closure of Storyville, the legal red light district that had operated openly since 1897. For 20 years, Storyville had been a world unto itself, a 38-block labyrinth of brothels, dance halls, saloons, and cribs, where jazz musicians had found steady work and developed the sound that would define American music for the next century. Louis Armstrong had grown up on its edges. Jelly Roll Morton had played its parlors. The district was a factory of culture dressed in the clothes of vice. When Storyville closed, the musicians did not disappear. They moved into the streets, the clubs, the private parties, the neighborhood bars. Jazz was no longer confined to a single district. It was everywhere, bleeding through the walls of every building in the city, carried on the warm night air that drifted up from the river. New Orleans in 1918 was saturated with music. It was also saturated with fear, suspicion, and ethnic hatred. The city's Italian population had grown enormously over the preceding decades. Sicilian immigrants had arrived by the thousands in the 1880s and 1890s, drawn initially by the promise of work on the sugar cane plantations outside the city. The labor was brutal, but it paid, and within a few years, a careful man could save enough to strike out on his own. The path upward almost always led to the same place, a corner grocery store. By 1918, Italian families owned roughly half of all grocery stores in New Orleans. These were small operations. usually a single room at the front of a building, with the family's living quarters directly behind or above it. The grocer and his wife worked the counter together. Their children played in the aisles. The store was not just a business. It was a home, a livelihood, and a family's entire claim to the American future, all contained within the same four walls. The Italian grocers were concentrated in the poorer neighborhoods, the lower French Quarter, which had become known as Little Palermo, and the working-class streets that radiated outward from the river. They were a visible and successful community, and they were resented for it. The prejudice against Sicilian immigrants in New Orleans was deep and occasionally murderous. In 1891, after the assassination of police chief David Hennessy, who had whispered, "The Dagos got me," as he lay dying, a mob had stormed the parish prison and lynched 11 Italian men, some of whom had already been acquitted at trial. It was one of the largest mass lynchings in American history, and it sent a message that the Italian community never forgot. By 1918, outright mob violence had subsided, but the attitudes behind it had not. Italians were considered not quite white. They were associated in the public mind with criminality, secrecy, and the specter of the mafia, a word that New Orleanians used loosely to describe everything from organized extortion rings to neighborhood grudges settled with a shotgun. And there was some truth, however distorted, behind the stereotype. A form of petty extortion known as black hand crime was real. It operated not as a formal organization but as a practice, a threatening letter demanding money, stamped with a black handprint, delivered to a grocer or a merchant who was expected to pay or face consequences. Those who refused were sometimes beaten, sometimes shot, sometimes killed. Those who paid were usually left alone, and those who went to the police were considered traitors to their own community. The Sicilians had brought with them from the old country a deep distrust of official authority. Disputes were settled privately. Justice was personal. The vendetta, a system of reciprocal violence between families or business rivals, survived the Atlantic crossing intact. Shootings and knife fights along Decatur Street were common enough that the stretch had earned the nickname Vendetta Alley. This was the world in which the Axeman's victims lived and worked. Italian families in small grocery stores, sleeping in rooms directly behind or above their shops, doors that opened onto back alleys, thin wooden panels that a man with a chisel could remove in less than a minute. The New Orleans Police Department was led by Superintendent Frank Mooney, a career officer who would later describe the killer as a murderous degenerate who gloats over blood. His force was large enough for a city of this size, but was not equipped in training, in technology, or in imagination for what was about to happen. Fingerprinting existed as a forensic technique, but it was not standard practice at crime scenes. No one dusted for prints at any of the Axeman's attacks. Crime scene photography was rudimentary. There was no centralized system for connecting cases across different precincts or jurisdictions, and the various police departments in the parishes surrounding New Orleans operated independently of one another. The city also had a retired detective named John D'Antonio, an Italian-American officer who had investigated the earlier wave of attacks on Italian grocers in 1910 and 1911. He would become an important voice in the months ahead, one of the few people in New Orleans who seemed to understand early on that the killings were not what they appeared to be. But in May of 1918, no one was thinking about serial murder. The concept barely existed. The phrase itself would not be coined for another half-century. New Orleans was thinking about the war, about jazz, about Storyville's ghost, about the summer heat already beginning to settle over the city like a damp hand. And in the early hours of the 23rd of May, in an apartment behind a grocery store on the corner of Upper Line and Magnolia Streets, a man with a chisel knelt at a back door and began to work. Andrew Maggio had just received his draft notice. It was May of 1918, and the war was on everyone's mind. He was a barber, 20-something years old, and he was not keen to go. So on the night of the 22nd of May, he went out drinking. He came home sometime before 2 in the morning to the rooms he shared with his brother Jake, adjacent to the apartment of their older brother Joseph and Joseph's wife, Catherine. He noticed nothing unusual, but then he was in no condition to notice much of anything. Joseph Maggio was an Italian grocer. He and Catherine had been married for 15 years and ran a small store and barroom on the corner of Upper Line and Magnolia Streets in one of the poorer quarters of the city. They lived in the apartment directly behind the shop, as most Italian grocers did. Their life was the store, and the store was their life. Sometime around 4 in the morning, Jake Maggio woke to the sound of groaning coming through the thin wall that separated his room from Joseph and Catherine's bedroom. He knocked on the wall, no response. He knocked louder, nothing. Jake roused Andrew, which took some effort given his brother's state. Together, the two men went next door. The first thing they found was the kitchen door. A wooden panel in its lower half had been chiseled out and removed. The panel lay on the floor. The chisel lay on top of it. They moved through the kitchen and into the bedroom. Joseph was on the bed, his legs draped over the side. Catherine lay partially on top of him, motionless. The bed was soaked through with blood. When Joseph saw his brothers, he tried to rise. He fell. He was barely alive, with deep gashes across his head. Catherine was already dead. They called the police. Corporal Arthur Hayton arrived first, just ahead of the ambulance, but it was too late for Joseph. He died within minutes of being found. The scene that Hayton walked into was one of extraordinary violence. Both Joseph and Catherine had been struck in the head with an axe multiple times, with enough force to fracture their skulls. But that was not all. Their throats had also been cut with a straight razor. Catherine's wound was so deep that her head was nearly severed from her body. She had asphyxiated on her own blood. In the bathroom, Hayton found the axe. It had been hastily washed, though blood still clung to the blade and to the sides of the cast-iron bathtub where it had been propped. On the floor of the bathroom was a pile of men's clothing, soaked with blood. The killer had changed into clean clothes before leaving, and on the bed, lying in the blood, was the razor. Police quickly determined that the razor belonged to Andrew Maggio. One of his employees confirmed that Andrew had removed it from his barbershop on Camp Street 2 days before the murder, saying he wanted to have a nick honed from the blade. Andrew was arrested. He maintained his innocence. He said he had been drinking, had come home late, and had heard nothing through the wall. He also mentioned for the first time, and only after being pressed, that he had seen an unknown man lurking near his brother's apartment around 1:30 in the morning. The police did not find this convincing, but they could not break his story, and after several days, Andrew was released. The evidence was circumstantial, and his account of an intruder, however belated, could not be disproven. The investigation revealed several details that did not fit the theory of a family killing. Money and valuables had been left in plain sight throughout the apartment. Cash was found under Joseph's pillow and in drawers. Catherine's jewelry was wrapped and placed beneath the household safe. The safe door was open, but nothing appeared to have been taken. Robbery was not the motive. And there was one more detail, a strange one, discovered by 2 detectives about a block from the grocery store. Written on the pavement in chalk, in what one officer described as the handwriting of a schoolboy, was a message. "Mrs. Maggio will sit up tonight just like Mrs. Tony," the message said. No one knew what it meant, at least not immediately. But after some digging, investigators found a possible connection. In 1912, an Italian greengrocer named Anthony Sciambra and his wife Joanna had been attacked in their home. Joanna had been killed. The name Tony was a common Americanization of the Italian name Antonio. The message appeared to be referencing a murder that had taken place 6 years earlier. This raised a question that no one in May of 1918 was yet prepared to answer. Had the man who killed Joseph and Catherine Maggio done this before? In the years between 1910 and 1912, there had been a series of attacks on Italian grocers in New Orleans. The details varied, but the pattern was familiar: break-ins at night, axes used as weapons, Italian families targeted in their homes. Those earlier crimes had been attributed to Black Hand extortion or vendetta killings within the Italian community. They had never been solved, and they had eventually stopped on their own. Now, 6 years later, a grocer and his wife were dead in their bed, killed with an axe, their back door panel chiseled away, their valuables untouched. And someone had written a message on the sidewalk connecting this murder to the last series. The Times-Picayune ran the story on its front page that morning, complete with a photograph of the death chamber. For a few weeks, the city absorbed the shock and moved on. It was wartime. People had other things to think about. But the man with the chisel was not finished. He would return in 5 weeks. 5 weeks after the Maggios were found, the killer returned. During the early morning hours of the 27th of June, 1918, a bakery wagon driver named John Zanka arrived at a grocery store on the corner of Dorgenois and Laharpe streets to make his routine bread delivery. The store was owned by Louis Bissumer, a 59-year-old Polish immigrant. It was always open early. Bissumer was always waiting. But that morning the store was locked. The lights were off. Zanka went around to the side door and knocked. After a moment, Bissumer opened it. His face was covered in blood. He told Zanka that someone had attacked him and pointed toward the bedroom at the back of the store. Zanka went in and found a woman on the bed, covered with a blood-soaked sheet. She had a terrible wound above her left ear. Bloody barefoot prints led away from the bed across the floor. The woman was Harriet Lowe, 28 years old. She was not Bissumer's wife. She was his mistress, though the two had been living together and presenting themselves as married. Bissumer had been struck above his right temple with a hatchet, his own hatchet, with enough force to fracture his skull. Lowe had been hacked over the left ear and would be left with one side of her face permanently paralyzed. Both were alive, but barely. The method of entry was identical to the Maggio attack. A panel had been chiseled out of the back door. The chisel was left on the floor beside it. The weapon, Bissumer's own axe, was found in the bathroom. Nothing had been stolen. Police arrested Louis Aubuchon, a 41-year-old black man who had worked in the grocery the week before. There was no evidence against him. He had given conflicting accounts of his whereabouts that morning, which was enough for the police to hold him. He was later released. Harriet Lowe, disoriented and in pain, told police her attacker had been a mulatto man. Her statement was discounted due to her condition. What followed was a circus. Lowe began making statements to the press, scandalous, contradictory, and increasingly bizarre. After investigators discovered foreign language letters in Bissumer's possession, she told police he was a German spy. It was 1918. The accusation was taken seriously. Bissumer was arrested, held for 2 days, and released when no evidence of espionage could be found. Then in August, as Lowe lay dying from complications following failed surgery, she changed her story again. She named Bissumer himself as her attacker. He was arrested and charged with her murder. He spent 9 months in prison before going to trial. The jury deliberated for 10 minutes and acquitted him. But by that time, the Axeman had struck twice more. On the night of the 5th of August, 1918, 28-year-old Anna Schneider was asleep in her apartment. She was 8 months pregnant. Her husband, Ed, was working late. Sometime in the middle of the night, Anna woke to see a dark figure standing over her bed. She was struck in the face repeatedly. Her scalp was cut open. Her face was covered in blood. Ed Schneider found her after midnight when he returned home from work. She was unconscious but alive. Anna would later say she remembered nothing of the attack beyond the dark figure above her. She gave birth to a healthy baby girl 2 days later. The windows and doors of the apartment appeared to have not been forced open. Authorities concluded she had most likely been attacked with a lamp from a nearby table. Ed told police that nothing was stolen from the home besides $6 or $7 from his wallet. An ex-convict named James Gleason was arrested. He was released for lack of evidence. The Schneider attack troubled investigators for a specific reason. Anna Schneider was not Italian. She had no connection to the grocery trade. She did not fit the pattern. Lead investigators began to publicly speculate that this attack was connected to the Maggio and Bissumer cases. But if it was, it meant the killer was not targeting Italians specifically, and that made everything harder to explain. 5 days later, on the 10th of August, the Axeman struck again in another house. Pauline and Mary Bruno were young women who lived with their elderly uncle, Joseph Romano, a barber. They shared a house in which Romano occupied one room and the sisters another. In the early hours of the morning, both women were woken by the sound of a commotion from their uncle's room. Pauline sat up in bed. A tall, dark figure was in the hallway, moving away from her uncle's door. She screamed. The figure turned and fled. Pauline would later tell reporters that he seemed to have wings, that he was awfully light on his feet, moving with a speed that did not seem human for a man of his size. The sisters described him as dark-skinned, heavy-set, wearing a dark suit and a slouched hat. They rushed to their uncle's room. Romano was standing barely with blood pouring from two deep cuts to his head. His room had been ransacked, but nothing was taken. He told his nieces he did not know who had attacked him. He walked under his own power to the ambulance when it arrived. 2 days later, he was dead. A bloody axe was found in the backyard. A panel in the back door had been chiseled away. After the death of Joseph Romano, the city of New Orleans crossed a threshold. This was no longer a matter of speculation or coincidence. The newspapers said it openly. An Axeman was at large. Police received a flood of reports, citizens claiming to have seen the killer in their neighborhoods, men finding axes propped against their fences, others claiming they had chased intruders from their porches in the dead of night. Some of the reports were real, many were panic. Armed men began sitting up through the night with shotguns across their laps, watching their families sleep. And then John D'Antonio, the retired Italian detective who had investigated the 1910-1911 attacks on grocers, made a statement to the press. He said the man responsible for these killings was the same man who had killed before. He described the killer as an individual of dual personalities, someone who could be a normal, law-abiding citizen, and who was periodically overcome by an overwhelming desire to kill. D'Antonio called him a real-life Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It was one of the earliest public attempts to describe what we would now call a serial killer, a person who murders repeatedly, driven by an internal compulsion rather than a personal motive. But the term did not yet exist, and so the city was left with the image D'Antonio had given them, a monster who wore a human face, who walked among them by day and came through their doors at night. After the Romano killing in August of 1918, the attacks suddenly stopped. Months passed, the war ended in November. Armistice Day celebrations filled the streets. The captured German submarine UB-88 was towed up the Mississippi and opened to the public. New Orleans began to breathe again. 7 months of silence, long enough for people to wonder if it was over when in fact it was not. On the night of the 10th of March, 1919, the Axeman crossed the river. Charles Cortimiglia was an Italian immigrant who ran a grocery store on the corner of Jefferson Avenue and 2nd Street in Gretna, Louisiana, a small working-class suburb on the west bank of the Mississippi, just across from New Orleans proper. He lived with his wife, Rosie, and their 2-year-old daughter, Mary, in the rooms behind the store. It was the same arrangement as every other Italian grocer in the region, the shop in front, the family in back, separated from the street by nothing more than a wooden door. Directly across the street lived another Italian grocer, Orlando Giordano, 69 years old, and his 18-year-old son, Frank. The two families were business rivals. There had been a dispute between them, a court case over some commercial matter, but nothing that anyone would have described as violent or dangerous. On the night of the 10th of March, the Cortimiglias went to sleep in their bedroom behind the store. Mary was in her mother's arms, as was common for a child that young. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, Rosie Cortimiglia was woken by the sound of her husband fighting. She opened her eyes to see a man in their bedroom. Charles was grappling with him, trying to keep the axe from coming down. It was a fight he could not win. The axe struck Charles in the head. He went down with a fractured skull. Then the man turned to Rosie. She was still holding Mary. The axe came down on both of them. Rosie's skull was fractured. The child was killed instantly. Orlando Giordano, across the street, heard screams coming from the Cortimiglia residence. He rushed over and found the family destroyed, Charles on the floor in a pool of blood, Rosie barely conscious and clutching her dead daughter. Giordano raised the alarm. Police arrived from the Gretna department, led by Chief Peter Lesson and Sheriff Louis Marrero. The scene was by now grimly familiar to anyone who had been following the New Orleans killings. A panel in the back door had been chiseled away. An axe belonging to the Cortimiglias was found on the back porch. Nothing had been stolen. Timbers had been piled by the back fence, apparently to aid the killer's escape. No fingerprints were found, no witnesses besides Rosie, who was barely alive. Charles survived. He was released from the hospital 2 days later, though his injuries were severe. Rosie remained under medical care for weeks, with 5 separate wounds to her head. When Rosie regained full consciousness, she made an accusation. She said that Orlando Giordano and his son Frank had attacked her family. The accusation made no sense on its face. Orlando was 69 years old and in poor health, too frail to have wielded an axe with the force that had fractured two adult skulls and killed a child. Frank was more than 6 feet tall and weighed over 200 pounds, far too large to have fit through the panel that had been chiseled from the back door. Charles Cortimiglia denied his wife's claim immediately and repeatedly. He said he did not know who had attacked them, but it was not the Giordanos. He was vehement about this. The police arrested the Giordanos anyway. Superintendent Mooney in New Orleans believed the Cortimiglia attack was the work of the same killer who had struck the Maggios, the Bassoomers, and the others. He saw the familiar signature, the chisel, the panel, the victim's own axe, the absence of robbery. But the Gretna authorities, Chief Lesson and Sheriff Marrero, had a different theory. They believed the attack was a vendetta. Two rival grocers, an existing dispute, an Italian community where such things were settled with violence. They had their suspects, and they were not interested in hearing otherwise. According to the doctor who treated Rosie in the hospital, the Gretna police had harangued her repeatedly during her recovery. They came to her bedside and asked the same questions over and over. Who hit you? Was it the Giordanos? Frank did it, didn't he? Rosie had initially said she did not know who attacked her, but the pressure was relentless. When she was well enough to be released from the hospital, Sheriff Marrero immediately arrested her as a material witness and placed her in the Gretna jail. She was held there until she signed an affidavit implicating the Giordanos. Orlando and Frank Giordano went to trial for the murder of 2-year-old Mary Cortimiglia. The only evidence against them was Rosie's identification, an identification that her own physician considered unreliable, that her husband actively disputed, and that contradicted the physical evidence at the scene. The trial lasted less than a week. Both men were found guilty. Frank was sentenced to hang. Orlando was sentenced to life in prison. Charles Cortimiglia, who had testified in defense of his neighbors, divorced his wife after the verdict. For nearly a year, Frank Giordano sat in a cell waiting to die. His father sat in another cell, serving a life sentence for a crime that the physical evidence said he could not have committed. Then, in December of 1920, Rosie Cortimiglia walked into the offices of the Times-Picayune newspaper. She was visibly ill, she had contracted smallpox, and she had something to say. She told the editors that she had lied, she had not seen her attackers, she did not know who had killed her daughter. She had accused the Giordanos out of jealousy and spite, because they were business rivals, because she resented them, because the police had pressed her until she gave them what they wanted. She said that St. Joseph had come to her in a dream and told her she must tell the truth. The prosecution did not immediately give up. At one point, Rosie was threatened with perjury charges if she did not return to her original story. But she held firm, and in December of 1920, Orlando and Frank Giordano were released from prison. They had spent more than a year and a half behind bars for a crime committed by a man who was never caught. The Cortimiglia case was the most devastating single attack in the Axeman's known series, not only because of the death of a child, but because of the destruction it wrought on everyone it touched. A 2-year-old girl was dead, a marriage was destroyed, 2 innocent men were nearly executed. A woman was coerced into perjury by the very authorities whose job it was to find the truth. And the man who had chiseled through the back door and swung the axe was still free, still unknown, and still, as far as anyone could tell, still in New Orleans. 3 days after the attack on the Cortimiglias, a letter arrived at the offices of the Times-Picayune. It was dated from hell. The letter was published on the 13th of March, 1919, 3 days after the attack on the Cortimiglia family. It was addressed to the editor of the Times-Picayune. The header said simply, Hell, March 13, 1919. The salutation read, Esteemed mortal. What followed was unlike anything the city of New Orleans had ever received. The author identified himself as the Axeman. He claimed to be not a human being but a spirit and a demon from the hottest hell. He said he was invisible, even as the ether that surrounds your earth. He said he was in close relationship with the angel of death. He mocked the police, he called them utterly stupid. He said they amused not only him but his satanic majesty. He bragged that they had never caught him and never would. He said he could kill thousands if he wanted to. He said he could visit the city every night. He said he alone knew who his next victims would be. And then he made a proposition. At 12:15 on the following Tuesday night, the night of the 19th of March, which was also the feast of Saint Joseph, the most important holiday in the Sicilian calendar, he said he would pass over New Orleans. He said he was very fond of jazz music, and he swore by all the devils in the nether regions that every person shall be spared in whose home a jazz band is in full swing at the time he had mentioned. Those who did not jazz it out, he wrote, will get the axe. He signed it simply with the Axeman. The letter was written in a style that was literate, theatrical, and grandiose. It referenced Tartarus, the deepest pit of the Greek underworld. It used archaic constructions like it were better that they were never born, and hoping that thou wilt publish this, that it may go well with thee. It was the letter of someone who had read widely, who enjoyed the sound of his own voice, and who wanted to be seen not as a common criminal, but as something larger than human. Whether the letter was genuine, whether it was truly written by the man who had killed the Maggios and the Cortimiglias and Joseph Romano, was impossible to verify. But the city of New Orleans chose to take it seriously. The night of the 19th of March, 1919, was St. Joseph's Night. It was a Tuesday, and by midnight, every building in the city that could produce music was producing it. Dance halls were packed to capacity. Restaurants hired every available musician. Neighborhood bars that had never hosted a band suddenly had three-piece combos crammed into their corners. Private homes across the city threw parties. Families who had never owned a phonograph borrowed one. People who could not play an instrument banged on pots and pans. Friends gathered in living rooms and parlors, surrounding pianos, singing at the tops of their lungs. A local composer named Joseph John Davila had written a piece specifically for the occasion. He called it The Mysterious Axeman's Jazz, Don't Scare Me, Papa. The sheet music went on sale within days. Its cover depicted a family playing music with looks of sheer terror on their faces, glancing over their shoulders as if expecting the door to splinter inward at any moment. Davila was such an aggressive self-promoter that some suspected he might have written the letter himself as a marketing scheme. There is no evidence that he did, but the suspicion says something about the mood of the city, a place where even terror could be turned into commerce. One resident reportedly wrote a public response to the Axeman, inviting him to visit. The writer promised the killer 4 scalps, but insisted he follow proper etiquette. He could enter through an open bathroom window, but please leave the door alone. It was gallows humor. It was defiance. It was the particular New Orleans reflex of turning fear into a party and daring death to dance. When the clock struck 12:15 on the morning of the 19th of March, the city was alive with noise. Every street was loud, every window was open, every house that could manage it was shaking with music. No one was killed that night. The Axeman, whoever he was, kept his word, or perhaps he had never intended to kill that night at all. Perhaps the letter was the point, the act of making an entire city jump at his command, of proving that he could reach into 350,000 lives simultaneously without lifting his axe. The newspapers reported on the festivities the following morning. The Times-Picayune ran an illustration of a terrified family frantically playing their piano. The tone of the coverage was almost celebratory, as if the city had won something, had survived a test, had passed over the way the angel of death had passed over the houses of the Israelites. But the relief was built on nothing. The Axeman had not been caught, he had not been identified, he had not made a mistake, left a clue, or given the police anything to work with. All that had happened was that a killer had told a city when he would not kill, and the city had believed him. The spring and early summer of 1919 passed without another attack. The letter seemed to recede into memory. People returned to their lives, but the silence did not last. The Axeman returned in August. On the night of the 10th of August, 1919, nearly 5 months after the letter, and 17 months after the first attack on the Maggios, a grocer named Steve Boca was asleep in his bedroom when an intruder entered his home. Boca woke in the darkness to see a figure looming over his bed. Then the axe came down. His skull was cracked open. He lost consciousness. When he came to, the figure was gone. Boca managed to get to his feet and stumble out of his house and into the street. He made it to the home of his neighbor, Frank Genusa, before collapsing on the threshold. The scene inside Boca's home was the same as all the others. A panel had been chiseled from the back door. The axe was left in the kitchen. Nothing had been taken. Boca recovered from his injuries, but he could not remember any details of the attack beyond the dark shape above him in the moment before the blow. Less than a month later, on the night of the 3rd of September, 19-year-old Sarah Lawman was attacked in her apartment. Lawman lived alone. When neighbors came to check on her the following day and received no answer, they broke in and found her lying unconscious on her bed. She had been struck in the head with a blunt object. Several of her teeth were knocked out. She was badly injured but alive. A bloody axe was found on the front lawn of the building. In this case, the intruder had not used the familiar method of chiseling out a door panel. He had entered through an open window. This deviation led some investigators to wonder whether the Lawman attack was the work of a copycat rather than the Axeman himself. The victim was not Italian. She was not a grocer. She was a teenage girl living by herself, and the method of entry was different. But the weapon was the same, the time of night was the same, the absence of theft was the same, and like so many of the Axeman's victims before her, Lawman recovered but could remember nothing of her attacker. Then came the final killing. On the night of the 27th of October, 1919, Mike Pepitone was asleep in his bedroom in the home he shared with his wife and 6 children. The family lived behind their grocery store on the corner of South Scott and Aloha Streets. Pepitone's wife was sleeping in the adjacent room. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, she was woken by a noise, a sound she would later describe as a struggle. She rushed to the door of her husband's bedroom and arrived just as a large man was fleeing the scene. Mike Pepitone was on the bed, drenched in his own blood. He had been struck in the head with such force that blood spatter covered the walls, the ceiling, and a painting of the Virgin Mary that hung above the bed. He died within hours. The axe was left behind on the back porch. A panel had been chiseled from the back door. Nothing was stolen. Mrs. Pepitone told police she had seen a large man leaving the room, but could not describe any features beyond his size. In some accounts, she said she saw 2 men fleeing, not one. There were 8 people in the house at the time of the attack, Mrs. Pepitone and the 6 children, plus Mike himself. The killer had entered a home containing an entire family and attacked the one man sleeping alone in his room, then left without disturbing anyone else until the noise of the assault woke his wife. Mike Pepitone was 35 years old. He was Italian. He was a grocer. He was the son of Pietro Pepitone, a man with his own complicated history in the violent world of New Orleans Italian organized crime. He was also the last person the Axeman is known to have killed. After the night of the 27th of October, 1919, the attack stopped. There was no announcement, no final letter, no dramatic conclusion of any kind. The Axeman simply did not appear again. Weeks passed, then months. The city waited, the way a person waits for a sound they heard in the night to repeat itself. It never did. The newspapers moved on to other stories. The war was over. Prohibition was coming. Jazz was heading north to Chicago and New York. New Orleans exhaled, slowly and without confidence, and tried to return to what it had been before. But 8 people were dead or dying, 12 had been attacked, innocent men had been imprisoned. And the man responsible had walked out of the city's story as quietly as he had walked into those back doors, leaving behind nothing but chiseled wood, bloody axes, and silence. The Axeman of New Orleans was never identified, but he was not without suspects. From the beginning, the most persistent theory was that the killings were connected to the mafia. The logic was straightforward. The majority of the victims were Italian grocers. Italian grocers in New Orleans had long been targets of black hand extortion, the practice of demanding money under threat of violence. Those who did not pay were punished. Sometimes the punishment was a beating, sometimes it was a bomb, sometimes it was worse. If the Axeman's victims had all refused to pay their dues, the theory went, then the attacks were not random at all. They were business, debt collection carried out with an axe instead of a ledger. The theory had some circumstantial support. The earlier wave of attacks on Italian grocers in 1910 and 1911 had occurred during a period of intense mafia activity in New Orleans, including the murder of a mafioso named Paul Di Cristina and the subsequent killing of his assassin in a grocery store owned by a man named Pietro Pepitone, the father of Mike Pepitone, the Axeman's final victim. The world of Italian organized crime in New Orleans was small, interconnected, and violent. Grocery stores served as fronts for rackets. Business disputes were settled with shotguns, and the names that appear in the mafia records of this period overlap, at points, with the names that appear in the Axeman case. But the theory had significant problems. The Axeman frequently left his victims alive. A mafia enforcer collecting on a debt or executing a vendetta would not have left witnesses. The entire point of such violence was finality, a clear message that could not be misunderstood and could not be contradicted by a survivor. The Axemen also attacked people who had no connection to the Italian community. Anna Schneider was not Italian, Sarah Laumann was not Italian, Louis Bessumer was Polish. If this was a mafia operation, these attacks made no sense. And there was the matter of the method itself. A professional killer does not chisel out door panels and use whatever axe he finds inside the house. He brings his own weapon, he works quickly. He does not ransack rooms without stealing anything. He does not write letters to newspapers claiming to be a demon from hell. The mafia theory explained some of the victims. It did not explain the killer. Detective John D'Antonio, the retired Italian-American officer who knew the mafia better than anyone on the force, rejected the theory outright. He agreed with Superintendent Mooney. This was not organized crime. This was something else, a fiend, a Jekyll and Hyde personality, a man driven by a compulsion that had nothing to do with money or power or debts. In modern language, what D'Antonio was describing was a serial killer. He simply did not have the term. The second theory was simpler and more personal, the vendetta. In Sicilian culture, disputes between families or business competitors could escalate into cycles of reciprocal violence that lasted for years. A wrong committed against one family was answered with violence against the other. That violence was then answered in kind, and so on until someone was dead or someone left town. If the Axeman's attacks were vendettas, personal grudges between specific individuals, then there was no single killer at all. There were multiple attackers, each settling a different score, using a method that had become familiar in the community. This theory explained the inconsistencies in the pattern. It explained why some victims were Italian and some were not. It explained why the method of entry varied slightly from case to case. It explained why Mrs. Pepitone said she saw two men, not one. But it too had problems. The attacks were too similar, too consistent in their broad strokes, to be the work of unrelated individuals acting independently. The chisel, the panel, the victim's own axe, the absence of theft, the attacks on sleeping people in the middle of the night, these details repeated across too many cases to be coincidence. And then there was the letter. A vendetta killer does not write to newspapers. A vendetta killer does not claim to be a spirit from hell. A vendetta killer does not demand that an entire city play jazz music to avoid his wrath. The letter pointed to a single mind, an unusual mind, a mind that wanted attention. Which brings us to the only named suspect ever linked to the Axeman, a man whose identity itself remains contested. In December of 1920, more than a year after the last Axeman attack, a man was shot dead on a street in Los Angeles, California. The shooter was a woman dressed in black. When the police arrived, she was waiting for them. She identified herself as the widow of Mike Pepitone, the Axeman's final victim. She said that the man she had just killed was the man she had seen fleeing her husband's bedroom on the night of the 27th of October, 1919. She said he was the Axeman. The dead man's name has been reported in various sources as Joseph Mumford, Joseph Monfort, or Leon Joseph Manfort. For decades, researchers attempting to verify the story were unable to find any record of a man named Mumford being killed in Los Angeles at the relevant time, leading some to believe the entire incident was urban legend. But more recent research by scholar Richard Warner has established that the man was most likely Frank Doc Mumford, born in 1875, a pharmacist by profession who operated under multiple aliases including Joseph Monfort and Leon Manfort. Warner's research paints a detailed picture. Mumford had deep ties to New Orleans organized crime. He led a blackmailing gang that targeted Italian Americans. He was connected to the 1907 La Mona kidnapping case. He was arrested for dynamiting the grocery store of a man named Charles Graffignino in 1908. Most significantly, his periods of imprisonment aligned with the gaps in the killings. Mumford was sentenced to prison around 1910. The earlier wave of grocer attacks stopped. He was released around 1915. The attacks resumed in 1918. He appears to have been briefly imprisoned again during the 7-month gap between the Romano killing in August 1918 and the Cortimiglia attack in March 1919. After the killing of Mike Pepitone in October 1919, Mumphrey left New Orleans. He relocated to Los Angeles, where he went into business with an associate named Angelo Albano, who had married Pepitone's widow, the same woman who would later shoot Mumphrey dead. Warner also uncovered a detail that gives the Axeman letter an unsettling new dimension. Mumphrey operated a jazz business in New Orleans' Garden District. After the letter was published and the city was gripped with the compulsion to play jazz, Mumphrey's previously struggling business saw an unusual surge in customers. If Mumphrey was the Axeman, and if he wrote the letter, then the demand that every household play jazz was not merely a power fantasy. It was a business strategy. But the case against Mumphrey is not conclusive. Not all of the Axeman's victims were Italian. Not all were grocers. If Mumphrey's motive was extortion or mafia enforcement, the attacks on Anna Schneider, Sarah Lawman, and Harriet Lowe remain unexplained. And the mafia, as multiple crime historians have noted, did not typically murder women and children. The death of 2-year-old Mary Cortimiglia does not fit the profile of a professional criminal settling business debts. Mrs. Pepitone, later Mrs. Albano, pleaded self-defense for the shooting in Los Angeles. She was sentenced to 10 years in prison, served 3, and then disappeared from the historical record. Mumphrey's death in 1921 brought no official closure to the Axeman case. No police department issued a statement. No prosecutor filed a posthumous charge. The connection between Mumphrey and the murders was not publicly established until Warner's research was published decades later. The case was never closed because it was never solved. The chisel marks in the doors, the bloody axes left behind, the letter from hell, all of it remains as it was in 1919. Evidence without an answer, a pattern without a name. And New Orleans, a city that has always made room for its ghosts, absorbed the Axeman into its folklore the way it absorbs everything. Not with resolution, but with music and with memory, and with the quiet understanding that some stories do not end. That is the story of what happened in New Orleans between 1918 and 1919. The victims, the attacks, the false arrests, the letter, and the suspects who were never convicted. But knowing what happened does not answer the deeper questions. Why did the killer chisel out door panels that were too small to fit through when other means of entry were available? Why did he use his victims' own axes rather than bringing a weapon of his own? Why did he ransack homes without stealing anything? Why did he write a letter to a newspaper claiming to be a demon? And why did he demand that an entire city play jazz? And what does it mean that a man who killed at least 6 people and attacked 12 more was able to stop, completely and without explanation, after 17 months? In part 2, we are going to go through the psychology behind this case. Not to solve it, the evidence for that is gone, but to understand what the killer's behavior might reveal about the kind of mind that did this. What his method of entry tells us about how he thought. What his choice of victims suggests about what was driving him. What his letter reveals about how he saw himself. And why this case, more than 100 years later, still refuses to let go of the city where it happened. The Axeman of New Orleans left behind no fingerprints, no witnesses who could identify him, and no physical evidence that ever led to a conviction. But he left something else. He left a method, and a method repeated across enough crime scenes can tell you almost as much about a killer's mind as a confession. The Axeman's modus operandi was remarkably consistent. He approached homes from the rear. He used a chisel to remove a wooden panel from the back door. He left the chisel and the panel on the floor inside. He then entered the home, found an axe or hatchet belonging to the residents, and used it to attack them while they slept. After the attack, he left the weapon behind, usually in the bathroom, the kitchen, or the backyard. He took nothing from the home, and he disappeared. This sequence repeated with minor variations across nearly every confirmed attack in the series. It was his ritual, his process, his signature written in wood shavings and blood. In forensic behavioral analysis, the way a killer enters a crime scene is one of the most revealing aspects of his psychology. It tells you how much he plans. It tells you how much risk he is willing to accept, and it tells you something about the relationship between his rational mind and the compulsion that drives him to kill. The Axeman's method of entry, the chisel, the panel, suggests a high degree of premeditation. This is not a man who acted on sudden impulse. He brought a specific tool to the scene. He selected a specific point of entry. He performed a task that required patience, physical control, and a tolerance for the risk of being heard. Chiseling out a door panel in the middle of the night, while the occupants sleep on the other side of the wall, is not a fast or quiet process. It requires steady hands and a willingness to spend several minutes in a vulnerable position, crouched at a back door, exposed to anyone who might step into the alley or look out a neighboring window. This patience, this willingness to take time at the point of greatest risk, is characteristic of what criminal psychologists call the organized offender. The organized offender plans his crimes in advance. He selects his victims deliberately. He brings tools. He takes precautions to avoid detection. He is methodical and controlled during the approach phase of the crime. But here is what makes the Axeman psychologically unusual. The entry was organized, the attack was not. Once inside the home, the Axeman's behavior shifted dramatically. The attacks were brutal, frenzied, and often inefficient, multiple blows to the head. Throats slashed, victims struck with such force that blood covered the walls and ceilings. In the Maggio case, both an axe and a razor were used, two separate weapons employed on two victims, which suggests a degree of chaos in the execution. Several victims survived. If the Axeman had been coldly efficient, if the same controlled mind that chiseled the door panel had carried the attack through to completion, the survival rate would have been 0. You do not survive an organized killer who intends you dead. But the Axeman left survivors at scene after scene. Bisumer lived, Lowe lived for months, Anna Schneider lived, Charles Cortimiglia lived, Rosie Cortimiglia lived, Steve Boca lived, Sarah Lawman lived. This pattern suggests that once the Axeman crossed the threshold of the home, something changed in him. The controlled, patient, methodical mind that had spent minutes carefully removing a door panel gave way to something else, something driven by fury or compulsion rather than calculation. In criminal psychology, this split between organized approach and disorganized attack is sometimes called the mixed offender profile. It describes a killer who demonstrates characteristics of both the organized and disorganized types, but at different phases of the crime. The approach is planned, the attack is emotional. The escape is functional but hasty. The weapon is left behind, the bloody clothes are discarded or changed, and the killer flees without taking anything of value. This profile is consistent with a killer whose violence is driven by an internal pressure that builds over time and is released in a burst once the conditions are right. The planning is the containment phase, the killer managing his compulsion, channeling it into preparation, controlling it until the moment he is inside the home and standing over a sleeping victim. Then the containment breaks, the axe comes down, and the thing that has been building inside him is released all at once, with a force that overwhelms whatever rational control had been operating during the entry. There is one more detail about the Axeman's method that deserves attention, and it is perhaps the most psychologically significant of all. He never brought his own weapon. In every confirmed attack, the Axeman used an axe or hatchet that belonged to the victim. He found it inside the home, in a shed, by the fireplace in the kitchen, and used it to kill the people who owned it. He brought a chisel, he did not bring an axe. This distinction matters. A killer who brings his own weapon has made a complete commitment to the act before arriving at the scene. He has decided in advance that he will kill. The weapon in his hand is proof of that decision. A killer who uses his victim's weapon has introduced a variable. He is relying on the weapon being there. He is trusting that the home will provide what he needs. One possible interpretation is practical. Carrying an axe through the streets of New Orleans at night would be conspicuous and difficult to explain if stopped by police. A chisel is small, concealable, and has legitimate uses. An axe does not. But there is another interpretation, and it runs deeper. Using the victim's own weapon creates a psychological distance between the killer and the act. The axe does not belong to him. It is not his instrument of death. It is theirs. He simply found it and put it to use. This may seem like a trivial distinction, but for a mind that needs to compartmentalize, that needs to separate the person who chisels the door from the person who swings the axe, the use of someone else's weapon may serve as a crucial psychological buffer. He did not bring death into the house. Death was already there, leaning against the wall in the form of a hatchet. He merely picked it up. Whether this reasoning was conscious or unconscious, the consistency of the behavior across every attack suggests it was not accidental. The Axeman could have brought an axe. He chose not to, every single time. That choice tells us something about the architecture of his mind, a mind that could plan with precision, kill with frenzy, and then walk away into the night, leaving behind the weapon, the chisel, the panel, and the blood. Everything he brought with him, he left behind. Everything he used to kill, he borrowed. He came with nothing but a chisel and an intention, and he left the same way. The Axeman's victims at first glance seem to tell a simple story. Italian grocers attacked in their homes at night, a clear pattern, a clear target. But the pattern breaks almost immediately upon closer inspection, and it is in the breaks that the most interesting psychology lives. Joseph and Catherine Maggio, Italian grocers. Louis Bisumer, a Polish immigrant running a grocery, not Italian at all. Anna Schneider, a pregnant German-American woman with no connection to the grocery trade. Joseph Romano, Italian but a barber, not a grocer. The Cortimiglias, Italian grocers. Steve Bocca, Italian grocer. Sarah Lawman, a 19-year-old girl living alone, neither Italian nor a grocer. Mike Pepitone, Italian grocer. If the Axeman was targeting Italian grocers specifically, then Bisumer, Schneider, and Lawman do not belong on the list. If he was targeting Italians of any occupation, then Romano fits, but Bisumer, Schneider, and Lawman still do not. If he was targeting grocers regardless of ethnicity, then Bisumer fits, but Schneider, Romano, and Lawman do not. No single category contains all of the victims. In criminal psychology, this is a significant problem for investigators and profilers alike. The victim selection pattern is one of the primary tools used to understand what drives a serial offender. When the pattern is clear, when a killer consistently targets the same type of person, it points toward a specific psychological need that the victims fulfill. When the pattern is inconsistent, the analysis becomes more complex. Either the killer has multiple motivations, or the apparent exceptions are not actually his work, or the pattern is not based on the characteristic that investigators think it is. Each of these possibilities deserves consideration. The first possibility is that some of the attacks attributed to the Axeman were not actually committed by him. The Schneider attack is the most commonly questioned. There was no chiseled door panel, no axe was found. The weapon appeared to be a lamp from a nearby table. The windows and doors showed no sign of forced entry. The victim was not Italian and not a grocer. If this attack were removed from the series, the remaining victim pool becomes significantly more coherent. The Lawman attack is similarly questionable. The intruder entered through an open window rather than a chiseled panel. The victim was young, female, living alone, and had no connection to the Italian community. The axe was left on the front lawn rather than inside the home. Both of these attacks may have been the work of copycats, individuals who had read about the Axeman in the newspapers and imitated his method for their own purposes. In a city gripped by terror, with every detail of the attacks published on the front pages, copycat crimes would not be surprising. If the Schneider and Lawman attacks are removed, the remaining confirmed victims are almost exclusively Italian grocers and their families. The Bisumer case remains an outlier. He ran a grocery but was not Italian, though his attack shares every other hallmark of the Axeman's method: the chisel, the panel, the victim's own axe, the absence of theft. The second possibility is that the killer was not selecting victims by ethnicity or occupation at all, but by something else, something that united the victims in a way that is less immediately visible. In serial offender profiling, there is a concept called victim accessibility. It refers to the practical ease with which a killer can reach, attack, and escape from a particular type of victim. Italian grocers in New Orleans shared a specific set of physical characteristics that made them extraordinarily accessible to a nighttime intruder. They lived behind their shops. Their living quarters opened onto back alleys. Their back doors were made of thin wooden panels. They slept in ground floor rooms that were separated from the street by nothing more substantial than a single locked door. They were also concentrated in specific neighborhoods. A man who knew those neighborhoods, who had walked those alleys, who understood which doors opened onto bedrooms and which onto storerooms, could move between potential victims with ease. If the Axeman was selecting his victims based on accessibility rather than ethnicity, then the Italian grocer pattern is not a reflection of ethnic hatred. It is a reflection of urban geography. The Italian grocers were not targeted because they were Italian. They were targeted because they were reachable. This interpretation does not eliminate the role of ethnicity entirely. The killer clearly operated within and around Italian neighborhoods. He knew the layout of these stores. He may have been Italian himself, or at least familiar enough with the community to move through it without attracting attention. But it reframes the victim selection from something ideological, ethnic hatred, mafia enforcement, to something more pragmatic. The killer needed victims he could reach in the middle of the night without being seen. The Italian grocery stores, with their vulnerable back doors and their ground floor bedrooms, provided exactly that. The third possibility, and the one that some crime analysts have found most compelling, is that the Axeman was primarily targeting women. Criminologists Colin and Damon Wilson have argued that the Axeman killed male victims only when they obstructed his access to women. In several cases, the woman of the household was more severely injured than the man. Catherine Maggios' throat was cut so deeply that her head was nearly severed. Joseph's wounds, while fatal, were less extreme. Rosie Cortimiglia was attacked along with her husband, but the killer struck her and the child she was holding with particular violence. In cases where a woman was attacked alone, Anna Schneider, Sarah Lawman, the Axeman did not kill a man at all. In cases where a man was killed, Joseph Romano, Mike Pepitone, the man was sleeping alone, separated from the women of the household who were in adjacent rooms. This pattern is consistent with what criminal psychologists call the sexually motivated offender, a killer whose violence is driven by a need to dominate, control, or destroy women specifically, and who deals with male victims only as obstacles. The sexually motivated interpretation is further supported by the attack on Harriet Lowe, who was struck over the left ear, a wound consistent with someone attacking a person lying on their right side in bed. The wound's location suggests the killer was standing over her, looking down at her face. This is intimate violence. This is someone who wants to see the victim as he strikes. None of these interpretations can be confirmed with certainty. The evidence is too old, too incomplete, and too contaminated by the failures of the original investigation. But the victim selection pattern, taken as a whole, suggests something more complex than a mafia hitman working through a list of debtors. It suggests a mind that was drawn to a specific type of scene, a sleeping household, a vulnerable door, a woman on the other side of it, and that repeated that scene over and over with variations for 17 months. The Italian grocers were not chosen because of who they were. They were chosen because of how they lived behind thin doors, in ground floor rooms, in the middle of neighborhoods that a man could move through unseen in the dark. They were chosen because they were available to him, and because the thing he needed to do to them required exactly the conditions their homes provided. On the 13th of March, 1919, the Axeman did something that most serial killers never do. He spoke. Not in a courtroom, not in an interrogation room, not in a whispered confession to a cellmate or a priest. He spoke to an entire city, through the pages of its largest newspaper, in a voice so distinct and so deliberate that it has been quoted in full for more than 100 years. The letter is worth examining not for what it tells us about the crimes. It offers no useful details about method, motive, or identity, but for what it tells us about the person who wrote it. Because a letter like this is not information, it is performance. The first thing the letter establishes is grandiosity. The author does not present himself as a man. He presents himself as a spirit and a demon from the hottest hell. He claims to be invisible. He claims to be in close relationship with the angel of death. He says he could kill thousands if he wished. In clinical psychology, grandiosity is one of the hallmarks of narcissistic personality structure. It is the inflation of the self beyond all realistic proportion, the need to be seen not as ordinary, not even as exceptional, but as fundamentally different from and superior to all other people. The Axeman's letter is saturated with this need. He is not a murderer. He is the worst spirit that ever existed either in fact or realm of fantasy. He does not merely evade the police. He is invisible, even as the ether that surrounds your earth. He does not simply choose not to kill on a given night. He passes over the city, like the angel of death in Exodus, sparing those who have marked their doors. The biblical echo is deliberate. The letter was written 3 days before the feast of Saint Joseph, the most important date on the Sicilian Catholic calendar. The imagery of passing over, of sparing the obedient and destroying the defiant, draws directly from the Passover narrative. Whether the author was consciously constructing this parallel or simply reaching for the most powerful imagery available to him, the effect is the same. He is positioning himself not as a criminal but as a supernatural force, something above human law, above human comprehension, above human judgment. This is not how most killers think of themselves. Most serial offenders operate in secrecy because they understand, on some level, that what they are doing is monstrous. They hide, they compartmentalize, they construct lives that conceal what they are. The Axeman did the opposite. He announced himself. He claimed his crimes publicly. He dared the police to find him and mocked them for failing. This level of public self-declaration is rare among serial offenders, and when it appears, it almost always indicates a specific psychological structure, one in which the killing alone is not enough. For most serial killers, the act of murder provides the psychological satisfaction they seek. The fantasy is fulfilled in the crime itself. The victim's terror, the control, the violence, these are the rewards. But for a small subset of offenders, the crime is only half the experience. The other half is the recognition. The audience, the knowledge that other people, the public, the police, the press, are aware of what he has done and are powerless to stop him. In these cases, the letter is not supplementary to the killing. It is part of the same psychological event. The murder satisfies the private fantasy. The letter satisfies the public one. The Axeman needed to be known, not identified. That would have ended his freedom. But known, acknowledged, feared, discussed in every home and every newspaper in the city. The letter achieved this. It transformed him from an anonymous attacker into a character, a figure with a voice, a personality, a mythology. After the letter, the Axeman was no longer just a pattern of crime scenes. He was a presence. The second significant aspect of the letter is its literary quality. The writing is not that of an uneducated man. It uses archaic and formal constructions. It were better that they were never born, hoping that thou wilt publish this, that it may go well with thee. It references Tartarus, the deepest level of the Greek underworld. It references Francis Joseph, presumably the recently deceased Austro-Hungarian emperor, as a figure in hell. This suggests an author who was widely read, who had some degree of formal education, and who took pleasure in language and rhetoric. The letter is not merely a threat, it is a composition. It has rhythm, structure, and a deliberate tonal arc from the mocking introduction through the boastful middle section to the theatrical demand and finally the flourishing sign-off. Whoever wrote this letter enjoyed writing it. The act of composition was itself a source of satisfaction. This is consistent with the narcissistic profile. The letter is not just communication, it is display. It is the killer showing the city and himself how clever he is, how articulate, how far above the foolish police and the terrified citizens who cannot catch him. The third and most psychologically revealing aspect of the letter is the demand itself. The Axeman did not threaten to kill a specific person. He did not demand money. He did not ask for anything that would benefit him materially. He demanded that an entire city play jazz music, and the city obeyed. On the night of the 19th of March, 1919, 350,000 people altered their behavior because a killer told them to. Every dance hall was full, every band was playing, every home that could produce music was producing it. The Axeman made a city dance. In the psychology of power and control, this is an extraordinary achievement, perhaps more significant to the killer than any individual murder. A single killing proves that you can destroy one person. Making an entire population change its behavior on a specific night at a specific time proves something far larger. It proves that you exist in every mind simultaneously, that your will has entered every household. That you have become, if only for one night, the most powerful person in the city, more powerful than the mayor, the police superintendent, the governor, because none of them could make 350,000 people do anything in unison. The Axeman could, whether he was watching from a window, listening from a street corner, or reading about it in the next morning's newspaper. The satisfaction must have been enormous. An entire city performing at his command out of fear of him specifically. For a narcissistic personality, this is the ultimate validation. Not love, not respect, not admiration, but obedience. compelled obedience driven by terror, offered up voluntarily by an entire population that would rather dance than die. There is a final question about the letter that has never been satisfactorily answered. Was it genuine? Did the man who chiseled the door panels and swung the axe also sit down with pen and paper and compose this elaborate piece of theater? It is possible that the letter was a hoax written by a journalist, a prankster, or someone seeking to profit from the panic. Joseph Davila, the composer who had sheet music ready for sale within days of the letter's publication, was suspected by some of having written it himself as a marketing scheme. But the letter was never disavowed by subsequent events. The Axeman did not kill on the night of the 19th of March, which is consistent with the author being the actual killer. And the attacks resumed after the letter, which is consistent with the same person continuing to operate. If the letter was genuine, it tells us that the Axeman was not merely a violent man with a chisel and an impulse. He was a man with a sense of theater, a need for recognition, and the intelligence to manipulate an entire city's emotions through the written word. He was performing, and the city of New Orleans was his audience. In every attack attributed to the Axeman, the police noted the same detail. Nothing was stolen. Money was found under pillows, cash sat in open drawers, Catherine Maggios' jewelry was wrapped and placed beneath the household safe, valuables were left in plain sight at scene after scene. The killer entered homes, he ransacked rooms, he opened drawers and scattered belongings, and then he left everything where it was. This is one of the most consistent and one of the most psychologically revealing details in the entire case. In criminal behavioral analysis, the first question investigators ask about any violent crime is whether the violence is instrumental or expressive. Instrumental violence is violence with a practical goal, a robbery that turns deadly, a contract killing, an assassination. The violence is a means to an end, it serves a purpose beyond itself. The killer wants something concrete, money, power, silence, revenge. The violence is how he gets it. Expressive violence is different. It is violence that is its own purpose. The killer does not want something from the victim. He does not need the victim to give him anything or do anything. The act itself, the breaking in, the overpowering, the destruction, is what he is after. The absence of theft in the Axeman case tells us with near certainty that these crimes were expressive rather than instrumental. The killer was not there for money. He was not there to collect a debt. He was not there to retrieve something that belonged to him or to punish someone for a specific offense. He was there because being there inside the home, standing over a sleeping person, holding an axe in the dark, was what he needed. The experience itself was the point. This distinction matters enormously for understanding what kind of person the Axeman was. An instrumental killer can be anyone, a hired enforcer, a desperate man, a business competitor. His psychology may be entirely ordinary. He kills because someone pays him to, or because he needs the money in the safe, or because the victim threatens his freedom. An expressive killer is something else. His psychology is the crime. The violence is not a tool he uses to get something. It is the thing he is getting. It satisfies a need that exists inside him, a need that has nothing to do with the victim as a person and everything to do with the victim as a vehicle for the killer's internal experience. But what about the ransacking? If the Axeman did not steal anything, why did he go through drawers and scatter belongings? Why did he open the safe in the Maggio home? Why were rooms described as ransacked at multiple crime scenes? One possibility is misdirection. The killer may have deliberately created the appearance of a robbery in order to mislead investigators. If the scene looks like a burglary gone wrong, the police will search for a thief rather than a killer with a psychological compulsion. But the misdirection theory has a problem. In every case, the valuables were left behind. If the killer wanted to create the appearance of a robbery, he could have taken something, anything, to make the scene more convincing. He never did. A second possibility is that the ransacking was part of the ritual. In cases involving serial offenders, investigators sometimes observe what is called post-offense behavior, actions the killer performs after the primary violence is complete, but before he leaves the scene. These behaviors often serve no practical function. They are not about escape or concealment. They are about the killer's internal experience of the crime. Going through a victim's belongings, touching their possessions, opening their drawers, handling their personal items, can be a form of psychological possession. The killer is not looking for valuables. He is inhabiting the victim's space. He is inserting himself into their private world. For some offenders, this behavior provides a sense of intimacy or dominance that the violence alone does not supply. The killing is one form of control. Being inside someone's home, handling their things, knowing their secrets, that is another form. A quieter one, but no less important to the killer's internal narrative. The Axeman may have gone through his victim's drawers for the same reason he chiseled through their doors, not because of what he would find, but because the act of doing it fulfilled something inside him. There is a third possibility, and it is the simplest. The ransacking may have been part of the killer's search for a weapon. He did not bring an axe. He needed to find one inside the home. In some cases, the axe was in the yard or the shed. In others, it may have been in a closet, a hallway, or behind a piece of furniture. The process of searching for it, opening drawers, moving through rooms, handling objects, may have left the appearance of ransacking, when in reality, the killer was simply looking for the tool he needed. This interpretation is less psychologically dramatic than the others, but it is consistent with the physical evidence. And it aligns with the mixed offender profile discussed earlier, a killer who plans carefully but does not plan completely. He knows he will need a weapon. He trusts that he will find one. He does not control every variable in advance. What all three interpretations share is the same foundational conclusion. The Axeman was not inside those homes because of what the homes contained. He was not after money or property or anything that could be measured or sold. He was after something that could only be obtained by being there, inside the door, inside the room, standing over a body in the dark. Whatever that something was, it was worth the risk of chiseling through a door in the middle of the night, worth the risk of searching for a weapon in an unfamiliar house, worth the risk of leaving survivors who could describe him to the police. It was worth everything to him, and it could not be obtained any other way. There is a detail in this case that troubled investigators in 1918, and that continues to trouble researchers more than a century later. The door panels that the Axeman chiseled out were, in many cases, too small for a grown man to fit through. This was noted at the time. The panels were measured, photographs were taken, and in several cases the dimensions simply did not accommodate an adult human body. At the Cortimiglia home, Frank Giordano, the man falsely accused of the attack, was more than 6 feet tall and weighed over 200 pounds. The prosecution's own case was undermined by the obvious physical impossibility of a man that size fitting through the opening in the door. But even an average-sized man would have had difficulty passing through several of the panels removed across the series. And there is another detail even more puzzling. In at least one case, the door was found still locked from the inside after the attack. The panel had been removed, the chisel was on the floor, but the door had not been opened. The lock was still engaged. If the killer chiseled out the panel to gain entry, how did he get inside without unlocking the door? And if he entered another way, through a window, through an unlocked side entrance, through some other opening, then why did he chisel the panel at all? This is the question that opens up the most psychologically complex territory in the entire case. In forensic behavioral analysis, there is a critical distinction between behavior that serves a function and behavior that serves a need. Functional behavior is anything the killer does to accomplish the crime. Picking a lock serves a function, it gets him inside. Striking the victim in the head serves a function, it incapacitates them. Fleeing the scene serves a function, it prevents capture. Need-based behavior is different. It is action that does not help the killer accomplish the crime, but that he performs anyway, because something inside him requires it. It is behavior driven not by the practical demands of the situation, but by the psychological demands of his fantasy. In criminal psychology, this need-based behavior is called signature. Signature is distinct from modus operandi. Modus operandi is how the killer does what he does. It is practical, functional, and subject to change as the killer learns and adapts. Signature is why the killer does what he does. It is psychological, internal, and remarkably consistent across crimes because it is tied to the core of what the killer needs the experience to provide. If the chiseled door panels were modus operandi, a practical method of entry, then we would expect them to be functional. They would be large enough to fit through. They would result in the door being opened. They would serve the purpose of getting the killer inside the home. But if the panels were too small to fit through, and if the door remained locked despite the panel being removed, then the chiseling may not have been modus operandi at all. It may have been signature. The killer may have chiseled the panels not because it got him inside, but because the act of chiseling was part of the experience he needed the crime to provide. This possibility raises an uncomfortable question. If the Axeman did not enter through the panel he created, how did he get inside? The most likely answer, given the evidence, is that he entered through unlocked windows or doors elsewhere in the home. In the Schneider case, no forced entry was detected at all. In the Lawman case, entry was clearly through a window. In other cases, investigators may not have checked every possible point of entry once the dramatic chiseled panel was discovered. The panel drew attention. It was visible, striking, and immediately interpretable as a break-in. It may have served as a form of staging, a deliberate piece of theater left behind to announce that the Axeman had been there. But staging implies an audience. It implies that the killer wants investigators or the public to see something specific. And while that interpretation is consistent with the personality revealed in the letter, there is another possibility that runs even deeper. The chiseling may have been a private ritual, something the killer performed for himself, not for an audience. In cases involving serial offenders with strong signature behaviors, the ritualized actions often function as a psychological trigger. They are the mechanism by which the killer transitions from his ordinary self into the state required to commit the violence. The act of kneeling at a door, the physical labor of working the chisel, the minutes spent in darkness, patiently removing a panel one sliver at a time. The sound of wood splitting, barely audible, in the silence of a sleeping neighborhood. For a killer whose violence requires a specific internal state, a state of dissociation, or of heightened arousal, or of psychological permission, the ritual of the chisel may have been the bridge between his normal mind and his killing mind. He could not simply walk through an open window and begin. Something inside him required the process, the approach, the labor, the transformation that the act of breaking through a barrier provided. The door panel was not the means of entry. It was the means of becoming the person who entered. This interpretation is speculative. It cannot be proven with the evidence that exists. But it is consistent with what we know about signature behavior in serial offenders, that it is often incomprehensible to outside observers, that it serves no practical function, and that it is repeated with remarkable consistency because it is connected to the killer's deepest psychological needs. The Axeman chiseled door panels at nearly every scene. He left the chisel and the panel on the floor every time. He did this even when the panel was too small to pass through. He did this even when the door remained locked afterward. He did not need to do it, but he could not stop doing it. That distinction between necessity and compulsion is the line that separates a criminal from a psychological case study. The Axeman crossed that line every time he knelt at a door with a chisel in his hand. More than 100 years have passed since the night of the 27th of October, 1919, when Mike Pepitone was struck down in his bedroom and the Axeman of New Orleans vanished from history. No one was ever convicted. The suspects were either acquitted, released for lack of evidence, shot dead on a sidewalk in Los Angeles, or simply lost to time. The police files produced no resolution. The physical evidence led nowhere. And yet the case refuses to disappear. Books continue to be written about it. The Axeman appears in television shows, podcasts, novels, video games, and the ghost tour that wind through the French Quarter every night of the week. His letter is reprinted in full in nearly every account of the case. His name is invoked every time someone in New Orleans mentions the phrase unsolved murder. The question is why, not why the murders happened. We have spent the second half of this story trying to answer that. The question is why this case, among all the unsolved cases in American history, maintains its grip on the imagination with such tenacity. The answer begins with the letter. Most serial killers leave behind crime scenes. The Axeman left behind a mythology. By writing to the Times-Picayune, by claiming to be a demon from hell, by demanding that an entire city play jazz or face his axe, the Axeman did something that almost no other killer in history has done. He gave himself a voice, a personality, and a narrative before anyone else could impose one on him. He defined himself before the police could define him. He named himself before the press could name him. He created a character, theatrical, literate, mocking, supernatural, that was so vivid and so compelling that it has survived intact for more than a century. Most unsolved cases fade. The victims are forgotten. The details blur. Without a resolution, without a name, a trial, a sentence, there is nothing to anchor the story in public memory. The Axeman anchored his own story. He wrote himself into the permanent record of New Orleans. And because the letter is so quotable, so dramatic, so unlike anything else in the annals of American crime, it gets reprinted and reread and reanalyzed with every new generation that discovers the case. The letter is the hook that keeps the case alive. It is the thing that makes people remember. But the letter alone does not explain the case's persistence. There is a deeper mechanism at work, one that operates beneath conscious awareness. In psychology, there is a well-known principle called the Zeigarnik effect. It was first described in the 1920s by psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik, who observed that people remember incomplete tasks far more vividly than completed ones. The explanation is that when a task or narrative reaches its conclusion, the brain files it away. The mental tension dissolves, the story is finished, the brain releases it. But when something remains unfinished, when the ending never arrives, the brain cannot let go. The story stays active. It occupies mental resources. It resurfaces periodically, demanding attention, seeking resolution. The Axeman case is one of the most powerful open loops in American criminal history. 12 people were attacked, at least 6 were killed, a letter was written, suspects were identified, trials were held, and then nothing happened. No conviction, no identification, no ending. The brain returns to this case the way it returns to an interrupted melody or an argument that was never resolved. It cannot accept the absence of a conclusion. It keeps searching for the detail that will close the loop. And it cannot find one because there is no ending to find. This is compounded by a second psychological phenomenon, the uncontained threat. When a murder is solved, the fear it generates is given a container. The killer receives a name, a face, a history. He becomes a specific, bounded thing, a person who did a terrible act and was caught and punished for it. The brain can process this. It can file it away. When a murder is unsolved, the fear remains diffuse. The killer has no face. He is still, in the psychological sense, at large, not literally, not physically, but in the space of the imagination where threats live until they are neutralized by knowledge. The Axeman has no face. He has only a voice, the voice in the letter, and a method. He is a shadow with a chisel and a borrowed axe, moving through the back alleys of a city that could not stop him, and could not identify him, and could not bring him to justice. That shadow has never been given a name, and so it has never been contained. It remains active in the imagination the way all unresolved fears do, not as a memory, but as a presence. There is one more reason this case endures, and it has less to do with psychology than with place. New Orleans is a city that keeps its ghosts. It is a city built on burial grounds, surrounded by water, saturated with the residue of every culture that has passed through it over 3 centuries. It is a city where the dead are buried above ground because the water table will not accept them below. It is a city where voodoo, Catholicism, jazz, and the occult have coexisted for generations without anyone finding that combination contradictory. New Orleans does not forget its monsters, it incorporates them. It turns them into stories, into songs, into tour stops, into the fabric of the city's self-understanding. The Axeman wrote himself into that fabric with extraordinary precision. He claimed to be a spirit. He claimed to be a demon. He claimed to be invisible. And New Orleans, a city that has always been half willing to believe in such things, has never entirely rejected the claim. He exists in the same mental space as Marie Laveau, as the ghosts of the La Laurie mansion, as the vampire legends of the French Quarter. He is part of the city's supernatural mythology, not because anyone literally believes he was a demon, but because New Orleans understands, in a way that few other American cities do, that some stories are more true as myths than they could ever be as solved cases. A solved case is closed, filed, finished. A myth is eternal. It lives in the streets. It is told and retold. It changes shape with each generation but never disappears. The Axeman became a myth because he was never reduced to a man. He was never given a mugshot or a trial transcript or a prison number. He remained exactly what his letter claimed him to be, a spirit, formless and nameless, hovering over the city in perpetuity. And New Orleans, which has never been afraid of its ghosts, made room for him. He is still there in the ghost tour, in the jazz clubs, in the old shotgun houses with their thin wooden doors and their back alleys that have not changed in 100 years. The panels have been replaced, the chisels are gone, the axes have long since rusted away. But the story remains open, the loop was never closed, the killer was never named. And somewhere in the warm night air of the city, carried on the same breeze that carries the sound of a trumpet from an open window, the Axeman persists, not as a person, but as a question that New Orleans has chosen never to answer. If you've made it this far, I'm curious. Do you think the Axeman was Frank Doc Mumfrey, settling mafia debts with a borrowed axe and writing letters to boost his jazz business? Do you think he was a lone predator with a compulsion he could not control, hiding behind the convenient cover of ethnic violence? Or do you think the truth is something stranger, that the attacks were the work of more than one man, and that the letter was written by someone else entirely? Leave a comment and let me know, and now have a good rest.